Welcome everyone to Catholic Sunday Scriptures in Context. This is a ministry of the Augustinian Order and St. Paul Parish. We are focusing today on the Feast of the Ascension. In some places it's on Thursday, in some places it's on Sunday. Our first reading is always on the Feast of the Ascension from the Acts of the Apostles. And in this reading, this is the final instruction that Jesus gives to his apostles before he ascends to heaven. The beginning line talks about Theophilus, and that name means lover of God. And Theophilus was a person who paid St. Luke to write the gospel and also to write this early history of the Christian church. And so Luke shows the connection between these two, because the story with which he used to end the gospel is the story that he chooses to begin the Acts of the Apostles. And the Ascension is the transition from the earthly ministry of Jesus to the early history of the church. And the Holy Spirit is the one who links these two units, one by instruction and the other by being witnesses. The time of 40 days represented the time that Moses spent on Mount Sinai and the time that Elijah was in the desert. It was a long time. It doesn't mean exactly 40 days. It meant, a sacred time, because it referred back to the other important transitions and moments in the history of the Jewish people. And he advises them to stay in Jerusalem because that he knows salvation must come through that city. And the cloud that took Jesus to heaven is a sign of God's presence. And the angels that appear in this story were the same as the angels that were at the tomb of Jesus at the time of the resurrection. And the angel talks about the return, but is very ambiguous about when that might happen. And here you can see the different things. There's Theophilus that he's talking about, and through the Holy Spirit that all this happens, and not to depart from Jerusalem. And the Holy Spirit will come upon you, right? And talking about Pentecost, and make you his witnesses. And then you see the cloud and the angels and talk about his return. Our second reading is from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. There are a couple options here. We're going to choose the first option. And God raised Jesus from the dead. That's the point of Paul's reading here. And he starts by asking for a prayer that they may understand and that God may reveal himself to them. And all believers should know three things: the hope of their calling, the riches that come from God's inheritance, and the greatness of God's power. Paul highlights all those in this reading. And it was God's power that raised Jesus from the dead. In the reading, he mentions principalities, authorities, and virtues. And there was a hierarchical understanding of the orders of beings, where they included angels and, God and those who have died. And now Jesus is higher than all of them. And believers will be granted insight into these mysteries. And the rule of Jesus is universal, is for all people of all time, not just for those who were there. And at the end of this reading, Paul introduces the image of the body, which he will use later to develop his ecclesiology, his understanding of the church. So there you see the spirit of wisdom and revelation, hope that belongs to the call, the riches of his glory, and the greatness of his power. And that God raised Jesus from the dead, and now he is above all other entities. And lastly, our gospel in this year B comes from Mark. And we need to know that this chapter was appended to the gospel later on. We believe that when Mark wrote his gospel, many of the people who had seen the risen Jesus were still alive. And he did not need to, he actually didn't talk about the resurrection in his gospel. And then this later story of ascending into heaven was, in some of the early manuscripts, this chapter does not appear. In Mark's gospel, this would be the last physical appearance of Jesus to the apostles. And he tells them to proclaim the gospel, but we're not sure what, in Mark's gospel, what that means. That was not clear. A word that was adopted later. The signs would happen as needed for the proclamation of the gospel. And as we see that in the Acts of the Apostles, different stories of healings and miracles and so forth. And Jesus was taken up by God, not by his own power. And now he is at the right hand and that is the place of favor in heaven. And the last lines are really just about the disciples and their early actions. It's like a quick summary of the Acts of the Apostles. So here you see, proclaiming the gospel to every creature, and that the signs that will accompany them. And then he was taken up into heaven. It's a passive verb here. And then again, but they went forth and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word through accompanying signs. Please pray for peace in our world. If you think this can be helpful to someone, please pass it on. Thank you very much.